Welcome to Glisso English. Real life stories.
Imagine walking home tonight and witnessing a terrible crime. You know exactly who did it, but there's a catch. The killer is the most powerful person in your town. If you speak up, your life is in danger. If you stay silent, an innocent man goes to prison for life. What would you do? Today we are diving into a gripping 10-chapter story called The Witness Dilemma. As we follow this intense psychological thriller, you aren't just going to see how a real-life crisis unfolds. You're also going to master advanced English vocabulary, situational idioms, and the exact phrases native speakers use when they are caught between a rock and a hard place. By the end of this video, you'll know how to describe high-stakes tension, debate difficult moral choices, and take your English listening skills to the next level. Get comfortable, turn on the subtitles if you need them, and let's begin with Chapter 1, The Shadow in the Alley. The rain was relentless, blurring the neon signs of the neighborhood as Derrick walked home from a late shift. He pulled his collar up against the biting wind, taking a shortcut down Elm Alley to save time. It was a route he usually avoided after dark, but tonight exhaustion won. Halfway down the alley, the sound of raised voices cut through the steady patter of the rain. Derrick froze, stepping into the deep shadow of a brick doorway. Just 20 feet away, under a flickering street lamp, stood Alistair Sterling. He wasn't in his usual tailored suit, but his commanding presence was unmistakable. Standing next to him was his enforcer, Gideon. They were confronting a local shopkeeper. "I told you what happens when you fall behind on your payments," Sterling said, his voice chillingly calm. Before the shopkeeper could plead, Sterling nodded to Gideon. What happened next took only seconds. A sharp argument, a sudden flash of steel, and the shopkeeper collapsed into the dark water on the pavement. Derrick choked back a gasp, his heart hammering against his ribs. In his panic to back away silently, his foot brushed against a loose brick. The faint scrape sounded like a gunshot in the quiet alley. Gideon's head snapped toward the darkness. "Who's there?" he barked. Derrick didn't wait. He turned and bolted into the main street, blending into the late-night crowd. It wasn't until he reached the safety of his apartment that he realized his hand was empty. In his terror, he had dropped his house keys, attached to a distinct custom keychain with his initials engraved on it. The next morning, Derrick woke up with a sinking feeling in his stomach. He'd barely slept, staring at his ceiling and jumping at every minor sound outside. He turned on the local morning news while making a cup of coffee he couldn't drink. The anchor's voice instantly caught his attention as a familiar street appeared on the screen. "Breaking news in the downtown district," the reporter announced grimly. "Beloved neighborhood baker Silas Vance has been arrested for last night's brutal alleyway assault." Derrick dropped his spoon, his chest tightening as he stared at the television screen. The news showed a photo of Silas, an elderly man known for giving free pastries to kids. "Police claim a witness placed Silas at the scene with a financial dispute as the clear motive," the anchor continued. Derrick shook his head in absolute disbelief, his hands trembling. He knew with absolute certainty that Silas was completely innocent. Alistair Sterling was the real culprit, and Gideon was the one who pulled the weapon. But if Derrick went to the police to clear Silas's name, he would have to explain how he knew. He would have to admit he was in the alley, which meant Sterling and Gideon would find out. Worse, Derrick remembered his missing keys with his initials, DM, engraved on the metal tag. If Gideon found those keys in the alley, they were likely already hunting for him. Derrick sat at his kitchen table, trapped between a crushing sense of guilt and absolute terror. If he spoke up, he put a target on his own back. If he stayed silent, an innocent man's life was ruined. Derrick arrived at his accounting office late, unable to focus on the numbers on his screen. Every time his phone buzzed, his heart skipped a beat, fearing it was a number he didn't recognize. During his lunch break, he walked past Silas's bakery, which was completely dark with a closed sign hanging on the glass door. A few neighbors stood on the sidewalk outside, whispering to each other with worried expressions. Derrick hurried past them, pulling his coat tightly around himself as the guilt ate away at his stomach. He spent the evening pacing around his small apartment, trying to look at his situation logically. He grabbed a notepad and drew a line down the middle of a blank page to weigh his options. On the left side, he wrote the words, "Speak the truth." Underneath it, he listed the consequences. Protect an innocent man, but face the wrath of Alistair Sterling and Gideon. On the right side of the page, he wrote the words, "Stay silent." Underneath it, the consequences were clear. Keep his safety, but watch an old man rot in a prison cell for a crime he didn't commit. The scale in his mind was completely unbalanced, no matter how much he tried to justify his fear. He realized that his silence wasn't just passive anymore, it was actively protecting a dangerous criminal. He needed a way out that didn't involve walking directly into the local police precinct, which might be under Sterling's control. As midnight approached, Derrick crumpled up the piece of paper and threw it into the trash can. He had to do something, but he needed a plan that wouldn't get him killed in the process. Derrick decided that walking straight to the police was a fast track to getting hurt. He knew Alistair Sterling had deep pockets, meaning several local officers were likely on his payroll. Instead, Derrick walked into a busy electronics store 3 neighborhoods away and paid cash for a cheap burner phone. He sat inside his locked car in a crowded supermarket parking lot, staring at the plastic device. His fingers hovered over the keypad for a long time before he finally dialed the tip line for the federal authorities. When the operator answered, Derrick disguised his voice, speaking in a low, flat whisper. "The man you arrested for the alleyway assault, Silas, is entirely innocent," Derrick said, his heart pounding. "Alistair Sterling was at the scene, and his enforcer, Gideon, was the one who used the weapon." The operator paused, asking for his identity and if he had any physical proof to back up his claim. "Look for a set of house keys with a custom initials tag in that alley," Derrick blurted out, before hanging up. He immediately turned off the phone, popped the battery out, and threw the pieces into 2 separate trash bins across the parking lot. He felt a sudden wave of relief wash over him, believing he had finally done the right thing without exposing himself. But that relief vanished entirely the following morning when he grabbed a newspaper at a local coffee shop. A small column on the 3rd page mentioned that the police had searched the alley again based on an anonymous tip. According to the article, investigators found no keys, concluding that the tip was an intentional distraction by a prankster. Derrick's blood ran cold as he realized the terrifying truth. The tip hadn't been ignored by the authorities. Gideon had either found those keys first, or someone inside the department had scrubbed the evidence to protect Sterling. Derrick couldn't shake the feeling that a pair of eyes followed his every move. The morning commute felt different, as if the strangers on the train were secretly watching him. When he arrived at his office building, he noticed a dark sedan idling across the street with tinted windows. He tried to focus on his spreadsheets, but his gaze kept drifting back down to the pavement below. During his afternoon coffee break, Derrick walked out of the side exit to avoid the main lobby. As he turned the corner, a tall figure stepped directly into his path, blocking the sidewalk completely. It was Gideon, wearing a heavy leather jacket despite the mild afternoon temperature. Derrick's chest tightened, and his instincts screamed at him to turn around and run as fast as he could. Instead, he forced himself to stand his ground, keeping his expression as neutral as possible. "Excuse me?" Derrick said, his voice trembling slightly despite his best efforts to sound calm. Gideon didn't move an inch, staring down at Derrick with cold, unblinking eyes that held no warmth. He slowly reached into his pocket, pulled out a metallic object, and let it dangle from his fingers. It was a set of house keys attached to a custom metal tag with the engraved initials DM. "You dropped something in Elm Alley the other night," Gideon whispered, his tone dangerously casual. "Mr. Sterling is a very generous man, but he values his privacy above everything else in this neighborhood." Gideon tossed the keys on the concrete at Derrick's feet, the metal clinking sharply against the ground. "Keep your mouth shut, accountant, or we will audit more than just your financial records." Gideon turned and walked away, blending effortlessly into the crowd of office workers before Derrick could even breathe. Derrick picked up his keys with a shaking hand, realizing his safety was completely gone. Derrick locked himself inside his apartment, sliding the heavy deadbolt into place with a definitive click. He stared at the custom keychain resting on his kitchen counter, feeling a cold weight in his chest. Gideon's threat echoed in his mind over and over, making sleep completely impossible that evening. Just as he finally began to drift off on the sofa, a sudden knock shattered the silence. Derrick froze, his muscles tensing instantly as he stared at the wooden door in absolute terror. He crept quietly toward the entryway, holding his breath as he looked through the small peephole. Standing in the dimly lit hallway wasn't Gideon, but a young woman holding a sleepy toddler in her arms. Derrick recognized her immediately. She was Maya Vance, the daughter-in-law of the innocent baker, Silas. He opened the door slowly, leaving the security chain attached to limit the opening to a few inches. "Derrick, please, I know you were walking home near Elm Alley that night," Maya begged, her eyes red from crying. "The police won't listen to us, and Silas's lawyer says we need an eyewitness to stand up in court." Derrick looked from Maya's desperate face down to the small child clinging tightly to her coat jacket. His stomach twisted into painful knots as the immense weight of his secret threatened to crush him. "I didn't see anything, Maya," Derrick lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth as he spoke. "It was raining too hard, and I took the long way home around the main avenue that night." Maya lowered her head, a tear escaping and running down her cheek as her last bit of hope faded. "If someone doesn't come forward soon, they're going to lock an innocent old man away forever," she whispered. Derrick closed the door gently, leaning his back against the solid wood as he slid down to the floor. He protected his life by telling that lie, but looking into her eyes made him feel like a complete monster. Derrick couldn't stay in his apartment anymore, feeling claustrophobic within his own walls. He spent his Saturday morning at a quiet diner on the edge of town, staring blankly into a mug of black coffee. A woman sliding into the booth directly across from him cut his train of thought short. She wore a sharp trench coat and carried a thick manila folder, placing it flat on the table between them. "Your name is Derrick Morris," she said, her voice dropping to a quiet but firm whisper. Derrick immediately gripped the edge of the table, ready to slide out of the booth and bolt for the exit. "Don't run, Derrick," she added quickly, opening the folder to reveal a badge. "I'm Detective Vance from the State Department."
Derrick blinked in surprise, noting the badge number and her last name, which matched the innocent baker's. "Silas is my uncle," Detective Vance explained, her sharp eyes scanning the diner for anyone watching them. "The local precinct is firmly in Alistair Sterling's pocket, which is why they buried your anonymous tip." Derrick's jaw dropped as he realized how she had tracked him down so easily. "I've been building a federal case against Sterling for 18 months, but I need an inside witness. I know Gideon cornered you outside your office, and I know they have your custom keys." Derrick felt a glimmer of hope, but the terrifying reality of the situation quickly overshadowed it. "If I testify, Sterling will have me killed before I even step inside the courtroom," Derrick said flatly. Detective Vance leaned in closer, her expression turning incredibly serious as she delivered her pitch. "Not if we catch him in the act of a major federal violation before the trial begins," she countered. "I can get you full protective custody, but you have to help me bait the trap first." Derrick found himself standing in the back room of Silas's dark bakery late on a Tuesday evening. Detective Vance stood next to him, adjusting a small, state-of-the-art recording device hidden beneath his shirt. The plan was incredibly dangerous, requiring Derrick to meet Alistair Sterling under the guise of an accounting consultation. Detective Vance had discovered that Sterling was looking for a new independent accountant to review his offshore records. "If he suspects anything, look directly at the smoke detector and say the word overdue," Vance instructed firmly. "My backup team is stationed in a delivery van just 2 blocks away, and we will move in instantly." Derrick nodded slowly, his hands freezing cold as he adjusted his collar to hide the microphone wire. An hour later, Derrick sat inside the lavish private office of Sterling's downtown corporate headquarters. Sterling sat behind a massive mahogany desk, puffing on a cigar, while Gideon stood silently by the door. "I appreciate a man who knows when to pivot," Sterling said, sliding a thick ledger across the desk surface. "My previous accountant had a bad habit of asking too many questions about our international distribution." Derrick opened the ledger, his eyes widening as he spotted clear evidence of illegal money laundering schemes. He carefully pointed to a series of shell companies, ensuring his voice was clear enough for the hidden microphone. "These transfers are highly irregular, Mr. Sterling," Derrick noted, keeping his tone professional. "If the federal authorities audit these specific accounts, they will trace the funds directly back to your name." Sterling laughed, a chilling sound that echoed off the glass walls of the high-rise office suite. "The local authorities don't look where I don't want them to look, accountant," Sterling boasted openly. Derrick kept his eyes on the ledger, knowing that the hidden device had just captured an absolute confession. He closed the book gently, realizing he had successfully gathered the evidence needed to bring the empire down. Derrick walked out of the corporate headquarters, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He made it exactly half a block down the sidewalk before a heavy hand gripped his upper arm. He turned his head sharply, expecting to see Detective Vance or one of her plainclothes backup officers. Instead, he looked directly into the scarred, unblinking face of Gideon, who smiled with cruel satisfaction. Before Derrick could scream or shout the safety phrase, Gideon shoved him roughly into the back of a black SUV. The vehicle sped away into the night traffic, leaving Detective Vance's distant surveillance van completely behind. 10 minutes later, Derrick found himself pushed into the center of a deserted, dimly lit warehouse by the docks. Alistair Sterling stood near a stack of wooden crates, holding Derrick's hidden recording device in his palm. Did you truly believe a state detective could protect you from me in my own city? Sterling asked sneeringly. He crushed the plastic microphone beneath the heel of his expensive leather shoe, pieces plastic snapping loudly. Gideon stepped forward, pulling a heavy steel pipe from the shadows and letting it scrape against the concrete. "I can make this very simple for you, accountant," Sterling said, leaning in close with a cold smile. "You are going to walk into that courtroom tomorrow morning and testify that you saw Silas commit that assault." Sterling reached into his coat and produced a thick envelope packed tightly with stacks of $100 bills. "Take this money, say the words on the stand, and you leave this city tomorrow a very wealthy man." Gideon took a step closer, raising the steel pipe slightly to ensure the alternative choice was completely clear. Derrick looked at the bribe, then looked over at Gideon's weapon, a wave of pure terror washing over him. He knew that signing his name to that lie would seal Silas's fate and destroy his own soul forever. With a shaking voice, Derrick looked Sterling dead in the eye and shook his head, refusing to take the envelope. Gideon raised the pipe to strike, but the sudden crash of shattering glass echoed through the massive warehouse ceiling.
"Federal agents, drop your weapons!" Detective Vance's voice bellowed through the cavernous warehouse. Dozens of tactical officers flooded through the shattered entry points, red laser sights painting the dark room. Gideon dropped the steel pipe onto the concrete with a loud clang, slowly raising his hands in defeat. Alistair Sterling scrambled backward, his face twisting in rage as the heavy envelope of cash fell into the dust. Detective Vance rushed forward, shielding Derrick and pulling him safely behind a wall of protective shields. The tracking device inside Derrick's watch had kept the state team exactly on his tail the entire evening. The next morning, the federal courthouse was packed to capacity with reporters and anxious neighborhood residents. Derrick sat outside the courtroom doors, his hands resting quietly on his knees as he took a deep breath. When his name was called, he walked inside, refusing to look at Sterling or Gideon sitting at the defense table. He took his place on the witness stand, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the absolute truth. Derrick recounted every single detail of that fateful night in Elm Alley, speaking clearly into the microphone. He described the assault, identified Sterling and Gideon, and explained why he had originally fled in fear. The jury listened in rapt silence as Detective Vance presented the recovered financial ledger to support his testimony. Within 3 hours, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict, finding Alistair Sterling guilty on all counts. Silas Vance was released from custody immediately, wrapping his family in a tearful embrace right outside the courtroom. Derrick watched the celebration from a distance, knowing his life in this neighborhood had officially come to an end. Detective Vance walked over, handing him a new identity packet and a ticket to a quiet town 3 states away. He had sacrificed his old life to save an innocent man, but for the first time in weeks, Derrick felt entirely free.
And that is the end of the witness dilemma. Derrick had to leave his entire life behind, but he saved an innocent man and finally cleared his conscience. Doing the right thing isn't always easy, but as we saw, staying silent has its own heavy price. Now I want to hear from you. Looking at the idioms we listened today on the story, which one of these expressions was completely new to you? Leave a comment below using one of them in your own sentence, and I will personally reply to check your grammar. And don't forget, you can find all the vocabulary of the story down below in the description box. If you enjoyed improving your English listening skills with this thriller, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us create more stories just like this one. Thank you so much for watching. Keep practicing your English, and I will see you in our next story. Goodbye.